Hello and welcome to The Pledge. This week saw a group of wannabe celebrities swan around in front of TV cameras, trying to be the centre of attention and impress each other while forming allegiances in order to win over the public. Oh, and apparently Love Island is back. All right, guys. Coming up, Greg says we shouldn't underestimate the establishment. Darling Rachel says we need to reconsider how we use certain words. Michelle says that the NHS doesn't need more money. And Carol says our mobiles are ruining society. But first, it's me. Less than half of young people are proud to be English, and 1 in 10 is embarrassed. Now, we've never been outspoken in our patriotism. We don't share France or America's idealistic view of their national identity. And we are aware of the dangers of the sort of nationalism we see from Putin in Russia or Erdogan in Turkey. In fact, we were so shy that for many years, the only people who would proudly brandish the St. George's flag were those on the far right. And for we minorities growing up in England, the flag struck terror in our hearts as a symbol of neo-Nazi violence. Fortunately, those days are over, and the flag has been reappropriated. But clearly, if I can get it out, but clearly, many people, particularly the young, are still squeamish about being English. I don't think that matters. What could be more English than such self-deprecation? But my message to the 1 in 10 who are embarrassed of our country is the following. Before you take your privilege for granted, have a chat to the refugees who gave up everything, risking their lives to come here. And if they don't remind you anything that redeems our country, then nothing will. Rachel.
Well, there is an old phrase, isn't there? To be born English is to win first prize in the lottery of life. And it's interesting that all the latest polling shows that the English are actually least proud about being English than the Scots are about being Scotch.
Indeed.
Or the Welsh are about being Welsh, or the Irish are about being Irish. And there's, you know, when you go abroad and you meet another English person, you don't cleave to them in the same way as a Scot might.
I found it fascinating because I did this debate on my LBC show, and English people ringing up and explaining why pride is... It doesn't make sense to be proud to be English because, of course, pride... being English is not an achievement, they said. We were born here. We didn't do anything to happen to be born here. We should be proud of our achievements. But the only few people that rang up and did say that they were proud to be English were asylum seekers. An Afghan asylum seeker rang and spoke to me at length about why he found himself expressing pride in having become British and getting the British, of course, passport and living in England, why he was proud to be English. And he was so thankful and grateful to this country. And that's what led me to think, OK, I'm not going to demand that we all express pride in being English, but certainly to be embarrassed to be English, I think, is a step too far for me.
I think we're, if it makes sense, I think we're quietly proud of not being proud, if that makes sense. I found a fantastic quote from Bill Bryson, who said, "What an enigma Britain will seem to historians when they look back on the second half of the 20th century. Here is a country that fought and won a noble war, dismantled a mighty empire in a generally benign and enlightened way, created a far-seeing welfare state, in short, did nearly everything right, and spent the rest of the century looking on itself as a chronic failure." And he says, to achieve so much and feel you haven't achieved enough is what I love about Britain. And I think that's true. And, you know, that report you're referring to, you know, it talks about young people not feeling patriotic. I think it's a bizarre concept for a young person. I think maybe you have to have lived a bit longer to have seen and experienced what your country does and the way it handles things before you might become patriotic. But I think if you said to young people, ask them individual questions like, you know, stuff about the fact we live in a democratic country, the fact that we champion freedom of speech. If you ask them stuff about that, they would call what they feel about that pride.
Before we go to you, Greg, and come to you in a second, we'll just have a look at the fact that this varies actually by region, from region to region. If you look at, for example, Lincolnshire and the Midlands, 90% of those areas identify as strongly English, whereas London, Oxford and Cambridge, only 32 to 45% of people in those areas identify as strongly English. And if you ask the question, who is proud to be English? 72% of those who responded yes were over 65, whereas only 45% of 18 to 24-year-olds responded with a yes. And 49% believe England's best years are over. 17% think they are still to come. Greg?
But both of you muddled up England and British in what you said, both of you.
I don't...
You used the words British, you used the words...
I said the Afghan asylum seeker acquired a British passport because we don't have an English passport.
But that seems to me the issue, is are we British or are we English? We don't... You can see why if you go to Scotland or you go to Wales, you can go north. Less so, I thought, Northern Ireland, but there the identity is partly with the South. But you can see why they are so. You know, I'm a Scot. You know, you find them. Whereas I don't think England has the same identity. And your point there was about more regional. Yeah. Identity, I think, is right. I mean, I think, you know, these figures show you're more proud to be a Geordie than you are to be English.
No, I think that those figures were saying that those from those regions are more proud to be English than the Southerners are.
Yeah, so like 66% of people in Hull, for example, are proud to be English. But to your point, you said that when you go on holiday, you'll see the Scots coming together, but you won't see the English. And I got back today, actually, from Benidorm.
You lost your glasses on the plane?
I lost my glasses, yes, whilst I was there. But my point was that, actually, I had a very different experience. You know, the English were very much coming together, you know, whether it was in the bars together, whether it was in the sports activities.
That's not because you're on the Costa del Sol, though.
No, but what I'm saying is it was very much...
But you don't meet each other and say, oh, I'm English, you're English, like that.
Well, no, but my chat-off lines are a little bit better than walking and going, I'm English. I've got a bit more banter about me than that. But we don't help ourselves, though. Like, we don't have St George's Day, for example, as a bank holiday. I would argue that we should, and we should actually be more proud of ourselves.
I think one of the problems is the St George's flag, and...
I tell you, we were petrified of this.
Yeah, I mean, there became a confusion between nationalism and patriotism, and the emblem of that confusion was the St George's flag, and also of a certain type of Englishness. And when Emily Thornberry went, you know, in 2014, she went down to the Essex by-election at Rochester and Strood, and she tweeted a picture of a kind of a white van in a driveway and a St George's flag draped windows, and said sort of Rochester scene or something like that on the tweet. She was regarded as very snobby, because what we're also talking about is a sort of sense that, you know, metropolitan Londoners think of themselves as cosmopolitan and not necessarily very English. And there we'd had this woman from this Labour Shadow Attorney General leaving Islington and going out into the sort of provinces where white man van lived.
True,
and so what essentially that expressed to me, I'm not going to bring in Brexit, but the Brexit vote wasn't really a vote against Europe. It was a vote against London and sort of London metropolitan, cosmopolitan.
To your
values.
point about the flag, Tory MP Nick Bowles said this, we can place to your intro too. He says, we've allowed the idea of Englishness practically to be partly seized by the far right, and also to become associated with the idea of a race, white Anglo-Saxon, rather than a nation, which of course has many races and many faiths.
Yeah, I'm constantly told that, by the way. So when I had this debate on my LBC show, I was told by some callers that, Majid, you can be British, but you can't be English because actually you're not white. And I said, I think you're mixing up Anglo-Saxon, white Anglo-Saxon with a nationality, with a country. England is, after all, a country. But there is still this debate, even within minority communities, who prefer to call themselves, say, British Pakistani over English, for the same reason. And I think it's partly because of the history.
If you go back to I last year watched the '66 World Cup final again, watched the tape of it. And what's interesting is the flag that was used there was not that one. It was the Union Jack.
Yeah.
You never see the Union Jack like you see the tricolour in all over France, or you see the Stars and Stripes all over America. We don't fly the flag here.
But in America, people are quite happy to be Italian Americans or German Americans. They're quite happy to say, look, I'm first of all American, but I'm of German descent, or I'm of Italian descent.
But you can never attack the flag. You can never disrespect the flag.
I think that the royal... I mean, we've got an image here from the from the royal wedding, and it shows that actually it did wonders for reviving the Union Jack there. And also, I think the Scots have always historically been quite proud to wave their own flag, as opposed to...
The Scots are much more nationalistic than we are. We've always kind of escaped the worst of nationalism, I think.
But I'm going to ask you guys, all right? So if I were to ask you, what is your least and most favourite thing about England and being English? Because I think everyone around the table is strong English,
Mine is queuing. We queue all the time, and we don't ask questions. We stand there like dummies in a queue.
Is that your favourite or your...
And yeah, that's about the thing I hate about England. We just have these manners, which I don't think should be employed in that situation. There's 20 of you, and nobody says, why are we standing in this queue? It drives me nuts.
What's your most favourite thing? Say something good.
Oh, say something good. Oh, no, I love...
I thought you loved queuing.
I hate queuing. I think it's the worst thing about it. No, I love the things I mentioned before, the free speech, the democracy. I love individual things like our literature. I love our music, stuff that our achievements.
Let's quickly whip round. Michelle?
I hate queuing. I was in a queue till 2 o'clock this morning at border control, so I'm with you on that. I like the seasons.
Yeah.
I really like the changing weathers.
Oh,
I
really?
like that. Yeah.
Wow. Greg?
I like the humour.
Yes.
And if you go through this list, is in the top one. I like the tolerance. I like that actually this is quite a tolerant society that adapts to change.
Yeah, it's true.
Rachel?
I'm very proud of our fantastic British press and also our great cup of tea. And you can never, ever get a good cup of tea anywhere else.
Oh, yeah, I like
Yorkshire
tea.
Yorkshire Gold.
OK, it would have been ridiculous for the police to have reopened the investigation into Andrew Newton, the man accused of trying to murder Norman Scott some 40 years ago. It would have been a complete waste of police time, given that more than half of the people involved in the affair are now dead, including the key figure of Jeremy Thorpe, and the subject was only back in the public arena because of a rather good dramatisation of the events. Back in the late 70s, as a young researcher at London Weekend Television, I had dinner with Scott in Devon just before the trial. And I have to say, I found him a rather sad figure who loved suddenly being the centre of attention. A few weeks later, of course, everyone was astonished when the British establishment managed to get Thorpe off the charge of conspiracy to murder Scott, when, as the BBC drama showed, the evidence against him was pretty clear. The interesting question is, could the establishment do the same thing today? Or has the world really changed?
So my default response to these sorts of questions is to say if there's a plausible explanation for something, always choose the plausible explanation over the conspiracy. No matter how, let's say, implausible the plausible explanation may seem, right? So we had these sorts of conspiracies over the death of Diana, and of course there's the, more recently, the death of Dr. Kelly after the dossier scandal of the weapons of mass destruction. I think the world has changed. I don't think even actually using the word the establishment makes much sense these days, because I think the way in which our democracy has evolved is that there isn't one interest governing our polity. And I worry when we talk about the establishment that slippery slope from that statement to finances controlling the world to Jewish conspiracy theories isn't too far away. I'm not saying, of course, you're doing any of that. Of course not. But I think it's re-emerging of late, both on the far left and the far right. And actually, one of the interesting things that our political extremes agree on is that there is some form of shady banking conspiracy controlling.
So under the Thorpe affair or the Perfumo affair, you don't think there was an establishment position?
Well, in those days, perhaps.
Yes.
Yeah. But I think what I'm saying is I think our democracy's evolved away from that.
I agree with you on conspiracy theories, actually. I always think that actually if you ignore the conspiracy and look at the cock-up theory, it works better, usually.
It's always cock-up, not conspiracy.
Yeah.
Can we just remind everybody of what actually happened during the Thorpe trial, which were, not to dig too deeply into it, you know, we saw the police got rid of files, they didn't publish letters, they didn't interview even Jeremy Thorpe, but in his summing up, Judge Cantley did not hold back when it came to directing the jury. He said, "I now turn to the evidence of Mr. Norman Scott. You will remember him well. A hysterical, warped personality, accomplished sponger and very skillful at exciting and exploiting sympathy. He is a crook. He is a fraud. He is a sponger. He is a whiner. He is a parasite. You must not think that because I am not concealing my opinion of Mr. Scott, I am suggesting you should not believe him. That is not for me. I am not expressing any opinion."
Not really. Say what he really thinks.
But the thing is, I don't believe for a second it could happen. Now, back then, the establishment could protect its own. These days, because of the press that you don't have much time for, Greg, it could never happen now because of the media and because of social media. There's too... I don't think... I think there's way too bright a light that shines on everything now that it couldn't be happened. Imagine today if a young man went into a police station and said, said a prominent politician had raped him.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's the other way round these days.
But if that had happened, that politician would be arrested
very quickly.
That politician would be arrested within the hour, guilty or not. They'd be arrested. And I think what happened because of the Thorpe thing and because of David Kelly and because Savile and Cyril Smith got away with stuff for so long, I think the police now go the other way. I think there's been an absurd overreaction, as we could tell by all the lies and fantasies too.
Isn't there a difference between the police and the judiciary?
Well, back then there wasn't. They all
still
worked together.
It's still about who is the judge and who is
So you have just reminded me.
employed.
I know, Michelle, maybe you want to come in here, but you have just reminded me, actually. When you say the difference between the police and the judiciary, there was, and I've said this before, of course, I've had this debate on the pledge before, that there was a cover-up with the grooming gang scandals.
That was on the tip of my tongue then, because I was just thinking, you know, I'm too young to remember the episode that we're currently discussing, but, you know, when I'm listening and thinking about cover-ups and all the rest of it, I do think of Rochdale, Telford, all those kind of places, because I'm sitting here thinking, well, actually, there was something very terrible going on for a very long time involving many, many people that wasn't properly investigated, that wasn't properly transparent and communicated properly. And there's a lot of people that feel let down today because of that.
Well, go back to Bloody Sunday, go back to Hillsborough. I mean, these things still
There was a huge cover-up at Hillsborough.
Hillsborough was a massive cover-up by the police.
Of manslaughter, aren't
Yes,
they?
and, well, they
Long
haven't been
time
found
ago, and
guilty
that's
of
why I don't think
manslaughter
that. I think the Rochdale thing.
But it did come out, didn't it?
But look what's happening now.
And it wasn't like this. I mean,
Rochdale
let's have a look at this clip, because Tom Mangold is asking Sir Ranulph Bacon some questions about what that kind of cover-up could look like.
We know that eventually the file finished up in the safe of the Assistant Commissioner of Crime. What about that safe? What did it look like? A sinister safe, a huge safe, or what?
Well, it was a whacking great old-fashioned iron and steel safe that stood up on a very substantial wooden stand, and it contained nothing but files. We never put money in it or anything like that. And it contained nothing but files.
And what kind of files are we talking about? Files on whom?
Well, the kind of file that we're talking about now.
When you
Things that were going to create a public scandal.
I'm just wishing we all still spoke like that. But, just very quick, because Rachel wants to say something. I just want to say that I think when I referenced the Rotherham thing, it wasn't a cover-up in the sense of locking files deliberately away in a safe, that style of cover-up. I think it was more out of fear.
No, Hillsborough.
It was a politically correct cover-up.
Rachel wanted to...
What I think we can take away from this is when it's the establishment covering for its own, I think these things can still happen. But I also feel that what we've learnt from the last 30 years is that if you're Liverpool fans or you're underage girls in market towns, you can be thrown to the wolves, and you will, they will not have your back. But Jeremy Thorpe, leader of the Liberal Party, old Etonian, he had to be.
But also, David, can I just bring another clip? I mean, David Steele, who was later the leader of the Liberal Party, was asked this week, did he think there had been a cover-up?
All of the evidence which is now being brought out makes it sound quite likely, doesn't it? I mean, it was in the midst of a whole lot of other scandals, and I think the establishment felt that they couldn't afford another one.
We made a documentary at London Weekend on the affair, and on the day that Thorpe was found not guilty, he phoned the company and said, if you put that out, we'll get you. And it never went out.
I hope you've still got it.
I don't know where it is. It's probably, I mean, London Weekend's been taken over so many times since then.
But this cover-up went...
Sorry, I have to make a correction very quickly before we carry on. It's just on the point of the police. I think they were found guilty of, not found guilty of manslaughter. I think it was unlawful killing the police in Hillsborough.
In Hillsborough, no, but there is now an investigation. There are now investigations and charges against certain policemen.
Yeah.
Okay.
But in the Thorpe thing, this file was passed. It went to Scotland Yard, it went to Special Branch, it went to MI5, and then it came back down. And every Prime Minister knew about the cover-up, and some of them are rumoured to have been tempted to use it. We don't know if that's true or not, but Harold Wilson was supposed to be going to release it when it looked like the Tories were going to do a pact with the Libs. Edward Heath knew about it as well. And so all of that, so subsequent Prime Ministers...
What, this is pre-1979?
This this is
when the actual trial took place.
Yes.
It all came out
They
in
all
the trial.
knew. They knew about this file. They knew that MI5 had the file. The file was then kept in the office that he's talking about, in the safe. So many people... I don't think you would get away with that kind of cover-up today, that
I'm not sure.
expansive...
If there's been a court case, I mean, look what happened there. There was a court case, and they were found not guilty. He was found not guilty of conspiracy to murder. I don't think many journalistic organisations would then run that. It would obviously find...
You would never have a judge today making that kind of summing up.
Well, not as blatant as that, but you can still get pretty opinionated judges.
Case closed. We've got to move on. Never one to be afraid of controversy. Alistair Campbell decided to hold a phone-in on the radio this week and discuss gender equality. What could possibly go wrong? Who should call but his own daughter? Grace had a few things to say. He called women birds. He was useless around the house and also didn't like talking about periods. Show me a bloke who does. I'm not bad for 61, he protested. I'm on his side. Outside the workplace, where's the harm in calling women girls, anyone love or darling, or my lover, if in Bristol? Once a street trader called me Blossom, not Madam, and it made my day, but I'm not sure my 24-year-old daughter would like it. Maybe we of a certain age have to accept that we are behind the curve, not woke. It could be the younger generation is right to school us. And just as Miss World contestants are covering up, it's time to make our words, as well as our behaviour, appropriate to the Me Too era. What do you think, my lovers?
Do you know, I despair of the sexist grammar police, I really do.
Okay.
You know, only urban sophisticates could object to being called darling or love or whatever. And Alistair Campbell, you know, he's a totally different case in point. He's rude. Every time I meet him, he's entirely rude, man or woman. It doesn't matter what you are. Yeah, well, maybe it is just to me, but you know, I do happen to be a woman. He's incredibly rude to me. But I love the fact that we call women love and darling and petal and honey. And in London, I heard one the other day, somebody calling a woman treacle, and I guess that's because you're sweet. And I think all of these things are said in warm, affectionate ways, and they're part of this colloquial, colourful language we have. And I feel, you know, I feel sorry for guys who must walk around terrified of offending people the whole time, terrified that some purse-lipped woman is going to call them a sexist.
Can I just ask you, there was somebody who had to resign the other day for saying in a lift that he was going to ladies' lingerie. I mean, are we just getting far too oversensitive about language? Or should we dinosaurs
I've got a daughter a bit like Alistair, who would give me quite a hard time on certain language.
Like, what would she tell you not to say?
Would she expose you in public like
when yes. But when I talk about girls, I mean, I talk about girls, you know, nice guy. Her view is, if you're in your 30s, you're not a girl, you're a woman.
Yeah, but you say guys as well.
But should we just hear what Alistair Campbell actually said? What Grace, how she schooled him?
You still call women birds, which I think isn't. I think you don't even think about the impact that has. You know.
When do I do that?
You do it when you're around men. Huh?
When do I do that?
You do it when you're around men. You do it when you're around men. I've observed.
Okay, do I really?
That's something that if you truly want to be a feminist, women aren't birds. Birds are birds. Birds can fly. Women can't fly.
And I like birds.
I mean, she doesn't like him using birds, but there are other... I think the issue she has is that there are certain words that we only apply to women, and it is a way of sort of demeaning... Can I just run through them? Yeah. Abrasive, bitchy, bombshell, curvy, ditzy, emotional, hormonal, hysterical, shrill, and
that's rude.
Well,
that's downright rude.
So we never apply to men.
I was in the studio when this happened, because I took over from him after he went off air, because it was...
Was he shaken?
He was sitting in for Nigel, and he usually... I felt sorry for him for a reason, and I don't know the guy. It's the first time I actually met him in person. The bloke, I should say. The first time I met him in person. And I just felt there was something unedifying with somebody's daughter calling in to embarrass them like that. You know?
So he didn't think it was funny?
Well, he didn't mention it. No, it wasn't set up. And he didn't mention it to me. No, I think perhaps the producers asked her to I don't know, but he didn't know about it, I think, because you can tell when, before that clip, is when she says hello, he instantly recognises her voice and starts laughing and says hello. So it was a surprise for him in terms of his reaction. I just want to say very quickly, I just think, look, there are certain words that we only use for women. Birds is one of them, but there are certain words we only use for men. Like bloke is one of them. of them, right? And then girls and guys...
Bloke is neutral.
Yeah, OK, but what I mean is this as an example. There's many words like that.
Yeah,
and
I think
that...
birds is quite offensive, actually.
Well, it may...
It's the only one I don't like.
Yeah, it may be. 56%, I've got a little thing here, 56% of women want bird banned, actually.
Only 56%.
Yeah, 56%. Dole, 45%.
I want to ask Michelle, because there's a lot of evidence that in the regions, as we might call them, you know, they say duck or chicken in the Midlands, and it's quite normal just to add these terms of endearments on, and they don't colour the sentence at all.
But like I do that all the time. Like I'll call people sweetheart or kidder, or and if you want to call me a bird, like his daughter just said, oh, you don't understand the impact of what that has. If someone calls me a bird or whatever, I don't really care. It's like the intention is. But then I will be completely honest, and this probably isn't great. You talk about people will call you like, hey, babe, or hey, sweetheart.
I hate babe.
If that is a relatively good-looking, non-sleazy guy, I don't mind. If it is some fat old, you know, lecherous-looking guy that's rubbing his thighs whilst he's calling me babe, I have a problem with that. So there
Why am I thinking
context is quite...
Do you get offended by a wolf whistle from a building site?
No, I think it's awesome.
It's
I love
nice.
it. I'm getting off it now.
How interesting.
Can I just bring... You mentioned that your daughter... No,
what does she think?
No, you just mentioned your daughter and girls, OK? This is a quote from Sir Roger Gale, who got hell last week because he was talking about his wife who works in his office, and he said, she's utterly dedicated to her job, as indeed are the other girls in my office. Everyone went mad because he referred to these women... He's an MP, he's Sir Roger Gale MP. Everyone went mad because he called these women girls, which I think is... You know, when I meet...
It's a bit demeaning, though.
I don't think it is.
Can I just say what I think? I actually, in the end, had to write about that, and I thought about that case really carefully, and what I realised was it's all depending on context. If you're in a bar and someone says hello, babe, to you, but if you're in the office and he says babe, let's say you go into a consultant surgery, and the consultant sitting there, let's say he's a man, says, hello, sweetheart. You know, you don't want that. You want a sense of formality.
But the same with men, though. I get on an aeroplane and the male air steward calls me a pet or a darling because they're gay, right? And it's fine, but I wouldn't expect that in an office.
I don't think all air stewards.
Just all of them. Every single one. These days, waiters as well. You know?
I got tucked in once by an air steward. I always found that a bit weird.
Was he gay, though? Maybe because that's the other thing.
He took me in. That was a bit odd.
When I meet a group of elderly ladies, right, I go, hi, girls. I go, hi, girls. And they quite like that because I'm saying it in a warm way.
What we need to say to our young people, girls or boys, is if someone calls you something that you're not comfortable with, have the balls to say, look, I'd prefer you to call me Michelle or this or that. So don't sit and get offended and analyse impacts of things. If someone's calling you something that you're uncomfortable with...
and on that note...
Shouldn't you just say, stop being so precious and silly about it all? It doesn't mean anything.
No, but surely it just changes over time. And what was acceptable 20, 30 years ago, people take offence at now. That's life.
I was worrying about young people's emotions and feelings. Maybe I come from a different generation where we didn't have time to think about your emotion and feelings too much, and we spend too much time worrying about how things impact on them now. Somebody calling you darling, I love, a petal is not going to harm you in any way,
What
shape,
I find
or form.
really interesting is, of course, they have their own destigmatised words that, for an older generation, are still stigmatised, like, for example, certain swear words. And so it also works in reverse. And I would say to young people, there are certain words you use that to an older ear would sound offensive, and yet those same young people say, oh, get over it and stop being so prudish. And so I think it works both ways, and it's just the way language evolves.
Now you mentioned the older generation, another great advantage of calling everyone darling is, like they do in the theatre, you don't know their name.
Of course,
you have no idea who you're talking to, so you say, hello, darling, lovely to see you, darling.
I worked with a guy who called all women darling and all men captain, forever. That's it, he never knew anybody's names.
Or boss. Guys call each other boss, don't they? Go, hello, boss, whatever, even if he's not your boss.
Just
call him boss. But it's sweet, it's all done in a... It depends how it's done, isn't it? When Alistair Campbell does it to me, it's aggressive. You know, but other men calling you petals...
What did he call you?
Oh, he's called me lots of names. Unrepeatable.
Unrepeatable.
I did feel sorry for him a bit, though.
No, you shouldn't.
Right, well, it's me after the break, and I'm prescribing reform, not cash, for our National Health Service. If if there's one record which seems to be stuck, it's the one playing over and over that says that more money will fix all of the NHS's woes. This week, the DJ playing that tune was Gordon Brown, suggesting we all pay extra national insurance and ring-fence the money for the NHS. Politicians from all parties have been making similar arguments, and a national newspaper poll showed a whopping 82% of us would apparently agree to that. Now, call me a party pooper, but I don't agree. I think before any of us give our beloved institution, the NHS, more money, we need to urgently make sure we have a service which is fit for purpose, one that spends its funds efficiently, has minimal waste, and one in which we, the public, don't abuse.
If you were starting a system today that said, I want to give you free healthcare at the point of delivery, you wouldn't, I agree with you, you wouldn't create what we've created. You wouldn't say to the state, you're the supplier, and we're all going to have it. But that's not where we are. I mean, the National Health Service is, you know, it's something that people in this country, as soon as you ask them any polls on it, any question about it, they love it, right? Now, I don't accept that all organisations can be more effective and more efficient, all organisations. But I don't think you could do it on the scale that you would need to do to not have extra money. The truth is, the demand is going up, is never going up, and the supply, i.e. the supply of drugs, the supply of things that can actually make you better, is also going up. So actually, there is always going to be pressure. I have sympathy for the people who work in the health service, because I think it's one of those jobs where it's never ending. You never finish. You know, you just, next day, you go into the average A&E department, there's another pile of people coming in that you've got to... It's a very difficult task.
But my key point to this is that if you listen to anyone, what they'll say is to fix NHS, it's more money, more tax, more money, more tax. What I feel very strongly is that we shouldn't be, and maybe it does need more money, but we shouldn't be throwing more money at something until we know that this something is fit for purpose and is efficient. And to your point, before I bring everyone else in, yes, we very much love the NHS, but we often don't respect it.
Yeah,
because, no, we often just don't bother turning up for our appointments. We often don't bother returning things like crutches or wheelchairs. We often, you know, we take prescription medicines on things that would cost us pennies to buy ourselves. You know, 40% of deaths in England are from lifestyle choices. So, yes, we love this institution, but we also play a part in helping to break it as well.
To your point, you're just talking about how we abuse it. 8 million people didn't turn up for appointments last year, and they schedule each appointment at 120 quid. So that's £1 billion. So the NHS, as much as we love it, I don't blame the people working in it. It isn't their fault, but I blame the people running it and managing it, because actually there is a huge... The truth about the NHS is that it's inefficient and it's unproductive and it's wasteful. Last year, 7.6 billion quid was wasted on stuff like wheelchairs, overpriced toilet rolls. They paid out 1.5 billion in compensation for negligence cases. You know, one guy, and I think it's a guy called Tim Briggs, he's the National Director of Clinical Quality and Efficiency. He says the NHS doesn't deserve more money until it gets its act together. I think it's him who cited the example. If you have hip operations and knee operations, if you just stop infections after those operations, which happen in the hospital, but they happen because of non-cleanliness. If you just stopped infections, you would save 350 million quid a year, and that's just in that one tiny section. So I think we've got to stop. The problem is it still works on the model of the 60s. Professor Ted Baker, who is the Chief Inspector of NHS Hospitals, he says you've got to change the model. But every time we try to change the model, it's used as a political football by the opposition.
No, it's not only used as a political football, it's also the public that don't want to change.
But it has to be restructured.
I mean, you know, I agree with you. It needs fundamental reform, but I'm not so sure that saves you vast sums of money. I think it makes it more efficient.
What do you call vast sums of money?
Well, I mean, what do we spend on the National Health? I don't know, 120 billion a year?
No, 116. But 7.6 billion in waste. Yeah. That's just on stuff. You know, you're talking about...
But that applies to all organisations. Anyone who works in a big organisation... No, it's not true.
I mean, I think Michelle's issue is is throwing more money at the NHS
not gonna solve
going
it.
to solve problems?
It's a sticking plaster.
The polls show that the public's prepared to spend more, and the person who's looked into this for the government suggests that the over 40 should pay 1p on their income tax, which I think is a great idea. But Jeremy Hunt is suggesting that funding is either feast or famine, and the NHS isn't good in either situation.
The biggest lesson of the past when it comes to NHS funding is that we don't do feast or famine very well. So we know that the last 7 years, when we've been in the aftermath of the financial crash, have been very, very tough. But we also know that the feast years before that, there was a lot of waste, a lot of misuse of resources, and actually a lot of disappointment.
Theresa May today, Thursday, announced that as a birthday present for the NHS, it's going to get a huge bump in funds. I just want to bring your attention to that. The last time there was a massive infusion of funds into the NHS under Tony Blair, and a book's just come out which said, after Tony Blair's commitment to an increase in NHS spending, we managed to find a way of encouraging over-medicalisation. Quality and Outcomes Framework was introduced in 2004. This promised to save 30,000 lives a year. It financially rewarded GPs for doing tests and prescribing drugs. It has cost $30 billion. And the author, James Leffernew, who's a former GP, asserts has saved no lives. It did, however, condemn millions to lifelong medication with all the risks. Some were... Anyway, so basically doctors are encouraged to prescribe, and we've seen a lot of evidence that actually if you throw more money at it, it doesn't actually hit the spot, hit the target.
But, can I just tell you a story about I had an operation 2 years ago.
Tell us about
on a hip, and I got given equipment. I got given walking sticks. I got given a walking frame. I got given a thing. And when I was better, I tried to return it. Now I had hundreds of pounds worth of equipment. I tried to return it. They told me to throw it away.
I know, I've got some crap.
And I said, "Are you kidding me?" And I gave it to a care home in the end.
For my son.
Stupid.
So the magic number, I think.
Stupid waste.
I think the magic number we need if we're going to carry on, you know, in the direction of travel that we're currently on is, I think, roughly $7 billion a year to keep up with the growth and demands on the NHS with the growth in the population.
We waste $7 billion a year.
So I don't know if efficiencies can cover all of that, because, for example, you mentioned the disease prevention. Some of those diseases are simply, you know, the hygiene standards.
Yes.
Even if you were up to, say, 99%, there's always going to be that 1% that's going to happen, right? So
it didn't used to happen.
I think it comes down to, well, the superbug is one of the reasons, but I think it comes down to, I think, for me, the kind of nation we want to be going forward, with the 70th anniversary coming up that you referenced. You know, the Danny Boyle Olympic ceremony kind of speaks to that a bit, and everyone else in the world looked on bewildered, while everyone here understood precisely the points he was trying to make.
The nurses jumping on the bed.
That's right, you know, and I think we just have to... It's doable with, you know, the ring-fenced tax being raised for it, but it's something which we have to decide as a nation if it's what we want to continue doing. But it will come at the expense of other things.
Back in the late 90s, I spent a year of my life wandering around the National Health Service doing a report for the Blair government. And what was interesting was you did come across... I mean, for instance, your thing about people not turning up for appointments. I came across hospitals, but they cracked that.
How?
But they cracked that because these were the days before social media, and they cracked it by phoning people up and asking them were they coming. And most of the people who don't turn up actually are old people who've forgotten, hadn't got diaries and all the rest.
You mean like restaurants do with reservations?
Yes, so you phone them up.
Yeah.
In both these cases, they'd stopped doing it. And they'd stopped doing it because the person who phoned up cost them money.
Yeah.
And actually, they didn't lose any money by people not turning up. It costs, but it doesn't lose any cash. And it's the very weird way of accounting in the health service that is part of the problem. And that's why I think if you were starting again, you wouldn't do this.
So they couldn't mark that cost off against the money saved with lost
appointments? No, one was cash. One was extra cash going out and they were short of cash. So they got rid of the person who did the phoning up.
Why don't we charge people who don't turn up? If you say you're coming, if you're going to... Even at GPs, if you don't come,
again, we looked at that. The cost of charging it and collecting it was too high.
But, you know, and now what you're saying about the timing thing, you can't even do that. I was called for a mammogram recently, and I was told to come at 13 minutes past 12. And I thought, well, that's a weird time. And I spoke to other women when I was there. It's timed to, like, 8 minutes for each one. So there's no time to ring people up now. It's an impossible thing to even think about.
I do think it's too glib to just sit round here and saying it could be made more efficient.
It could.
It is difficult. It is difficult.
Well, it could, but I don't think it's going to raise the 7 billion.
I don't think it's glib. I just think it's common sense. And you're saying about 7 billion, and can we get it? There's a report here that's Lord Carter of Coles. He's done one, and he's identified 5 billion almost straight away that you could make savings, efficiency savings. 2 billion through better management of staff and sickness, 1 billion on procurement, 1 billion of better management of estates, and 1 billion through the drugs bill. There will be loads of different things. So procurement, for example, you'll know, it's not that difficult to sort out your procurement.
Get your toilet rails right,
exactly. And to do joined-up purchasing. I mean, this is...
But a lot of them do that. What we discovered, though, what you did discover is that you would find a hospital where they'd done something quite effective and efficient, and you went to the hospital up the road and they'd never heard of it.
But that's...
Okay, guys,
now, if it was a free market economy, which I'm not suggesting we should be, but if it was a free market economy, you have to compete with them or you lose.
Yeah, or you just implement a best practice sharing model. So if the hospital that you're mentioning is doing this...
Can we stop? Listen, we've got to go.
We'll sort it out.
We got you sorted out in the break. You're watching The Pledge on Sky News. I'm up next, and I'm saying it's time we gave up these. Welcome back. Now, this week, Apple announced new technology that will limit the amount of time we spend on our phones. Maybe they're finally realising their iPhone monster could be having an effect on people's behaviours, their mental health and their brain chemistry. It's wrecking lives, personal relationships, creating stress, anxiety and loneliness in both the young and the old. Teenagers who just used to get bullied in the playground now get bullied and taunted every day online. There's evidence that all of us, talk less to each other, mix less, have sex less, and have fewer conversations because we like our phones better than we like people. We check them incessantly, even when we're with someone else. Our ability to socially interact, which has taken millennia to develop, has been stunted by those little screens and is pushing us back into shells from which some may never emerge. Yes, the smartphone looked like a wonderful experiment, but no one knows the final outcome and what the effects of them will be. But so far, it isn't looking good. Time for a digital detox?
I think that's a very interesting opinion. I think Apple might have something to say. Should we just quickly start with looking at what Apple, what they regard their mission statement as, because we're talking very much about the smartphone. So if we look at Apple's mission statement, for example, what they say is Apple's revolutionised personal technology with the introduction of the Macintosh in 1984. Today, Apple leads the world in innovation and empowers people with breakthrough services, including the App Store, Apple Music, Apple Pay and iCloud. Apple's more than 100,000 employees are dedicated to making the best products on Earth and to leaving the world better than we found it. So that would be their view, I imagine. However...
so the money they make is irrelevant?
Well, there you go.
Yes, they're just doing it everyone good.
I agree wholeheartedly with you. I'm quite an old-fashioned individual, and I think it's quite sad how addicted people are to their telephones and how... little people seem to be able to have proper interactions with each other. And there's a former Facebook exec, and I found there's a really interesting interview that he did where he's actually saying, and I'll quote him, he says that he feels that within Facebook they created tools that are ripping apart the social fabric of how society works. I think that's very strong, but I think it's very accurate. I feel that technology, and I work in technology, and I believe it's a force for good in many cases, but I think that the addiction that we see, it is tragic. I've just been on holiday, as I said, and I was shocked by how many children... You go to the restaurants, and the children are just sat down, there's a computer, there's a tablet, there's a phone. They don't even talk to their parents. The parents are not stimulating the kids, they're just plonking phones down and...
But it's interesting. It's interesting listening to Apple's mission statement there. It was two of Apple's biggest investors 5 or 6 months ago who wrote an open letter to shareholders and told them that they wanted some research done on the effects it had on mental health, because they said this wasn't just good business sense, it was the right thing to do. But there are lots of psychologists and psychiatrists murderers, putting stuff out there. There's a lady called, where's she gone? It's gone, yes, a lady called Jean Twenich, and she's the author of Glen and a professor of psychology at San Diego State University. She says teenagers, and it's teenagers that worry me the most, who spend 5 hours or more a day on electronic devices are 71% more likely to have a risk factor for suicide than those who spend less than 1 hour a day.
I want to say something. I want to...
You're going to defend it,
I want to
obviously,
disagree,
because you're on it all the time.
Yeah, defending your husband as well, who's always on his
Who's
phone
got
carrying-
2 iPhones,
Right.
yes.
Now, I've got to say, right, I've got a different way of looking at these things. Whereas before, you would pick up a newspaper, you would pick up a pen,
Yeah.
you would pick up an A to Z, you would go to the bank, you would go to the fax machine, you would pick up a remote control, and you would turn on the television, and you would have a separate camera.
Yeah.
All that's happened is all of those separate and distinct functions have been put into one
That's
device.
not what's happened.
So why it feels like we're going back to this more and more, why it feels like addiction, is because what we're doing is using those same functions, but instead of going in separate directions, we're going to one device for them.
Lots of evidence out there, massive big survey of the States currently saying that teenagers talk less, date less, have sex less, which maybe no bad thing, but they party less. And the only thing that's increasing is their loneliness and their social isolation.
Allow me to, on that note, I do concede that teenagers, they are showing these, let's call them symptoms, right? I think the problem here is when I describe it in terms of services and not the actual addiction to the device, it's one of the particular services I just described.
But you can't separate the two.
That they're addicted to, and that is social media. And so if we were to hypothetically remove social media from the picture, the device itself, the phone, when it's used for GPS, when it's used as a camera, when it's used as a phone or a television, isn't necessarily addictive. What makes it addictive is the feedback loop.
It sort of is, because if you're watching TV on there, usually people watch TV in a family. You don't always watch TV on your own. I mean, you know, we're talking... It is kids that worry me the most. There is evidence that it's actually affecting their brain patterns. So the things that they're doing as teenagers, it sets their behaviour for adulthood. And if this is what they do for many, many hours in a day, that's how they're going to be. As I said in the intro, it took us millennia. What makes us human beings is the way we communicate.
the jury's out on the evidence, isn't it?
And this is... Well, there's lots of evidence.
Can we come in? I don't think there's enough research been done. I was at a university thing recently and asked the people who were involved in health and said, well, and they say that there's a lot more research needs to be done. I quite like Simon Cowell.
Yes,
has famously...
He's gone without for 10 months.
He's gone without it for 10 months. I love what he said. He said he's limited the time his 4-year-old is allowed to spend on the iPad. Instead, he'd like to watch television. And I think, well, actually, when I go back 20 years ago, that's what they said about... I mean, I always remember leaving London Weekend Television and going walking in Crete with this wonderful old lady who was the guide, and we all slept out in the open one night, and she said to me, Greg, has television been for the good of mankind or
we're
not?
Sounding a bit like Luddites.
Yeah, and I just basically said, it doesn't matter, it's here, it's not going to change. And I think it's the same here. We've got to find out how to adapt to these things. I personally, I got mine. There goes my mic. I've got mine. I love it.
Yes, I mean, I know, and they're good for us. But, you know, I look at people that I know, and I think it's changed the way we socially interact with each other. Rachel.
I remember my husband said to me, quoting that famous Diana thing, there are 3 of us in this marriage, you, me and your iPhone. And I think we're all having affairs with our smartphones to a greater and lesser extent, and I think we need to manage that. And the statistics are that 91% of us have a mobile phone, and that 34% of adults look at it 5 minutes.
That's the social media.
5 minutes.
That's the social media, right?
No, they look at their phones. It's not necessarily... I don't look at social media.
Can I just say...
I look at Twitter to see what's happened.
One of the things I loved is Arwa Mahdawi wrote a column in The Guardian responding to this Simon Cowell stuff, and I actually really think she made an insightful point, and it's worthy of consideration, and that is that Simon Cowell can afford to put his phone down.
Uber drivers can't.
Uber drivers can't. Deliverers can't. And I think there is something to that as well, which is that, you know, if you want to get hold of Simon Cowell, you're going to physically, if you need him in the music industry, you're going to actually run over neighbourhood blocks and knock on his door to get hold of him, because you have to get hold of him.
Can I just show you guys a little clip of yourselves on your phone today? Have a look at this.
Oh, no, it's me.
Now, here we go. There's Majid.
Yep.
On it, and as soon as I walked in the studio, there's Rachel on Earth straight away.
I was texting my son because he had a job interview.
Yeah. And every week it's saying the biggest criminal of all of this is Afua, because she's on it. She's on it like three seconds before the phone stopped.
You were in the break, I just saw
you. were in the break. And the only reason mine's in is because I was told to bring it in.
You mentioned, like, Luddites. You said that we're all sounding a bit like Luddites. I'm not a Luddite. I work in technology, and I do believe technology is a force for good.
Tell us.
Well, I've done technology transformation in organisations for many, many years, where I've gone into organisations and looked at how can you leverage technology to do things better and differently. I'm now involved with a new crypto project, so a new financial services business. So I'm passionate about technology and what that does. But I don't think it's Luddite-ish to express a concern about how it is. And that former Facebook exec, sums it up for me when he says it's changing the fabric of society.
Social media.
And it is, I agree with you.
But so did television. So did radio before it.
Yes, but the television the phone's become part of our ID. It's a digitalised version of us. And you said it before. It has conversations on it. It has all our personal details on it. It has our banking stuff on it. It has become an extension of us to the point where you really believe you can't live without it.
If you were to take social
crazy.
media off it, would you be less concerned? Because my thesis is it's mainly the Twitter.
No, I agree with that. I think I would like to see a lot more research done on, particularly on kids, on what impact social media has. Because I've watched younger kids, and some of their behaviour is quite worrying.
Yes.
But is that just because I'm old?
No, it's not. It's not. But anyway, listen, that's all we've got time for on that debate. But before we go, there's just time for this. We've all been there, whether it was in a school assembly, in church, an awkward karaoke night. Everyone else is singing and you're expected to be joining in, but you just don't know the words. So you hum along, and when you catch a word you recognise, you belt it out especially loud to compensate. Now, that happened to President Donald Trump this week during a rendition of God Bless America at an event in the White House. He started confidently enough, but then seemed to get a little less sure of himself. President Trump, you are our hapless hummer of the week. That's all we've got time for this week. But if you want to join the debate, just search for The Pledge on Facebook or Twitter. Thanks for watching.